Hi, and welcome back to Sociology. Today we're going to continue our conversation about the foundational theories on social problems. Next, we're going to talk about the conflict perspective. So the conflict perspective looks at social problems as something that emerges out of the major contradictions in the way society is organized. So Marx, if you've taken a sociology class before or are familiar with Karl Marx, he identified that the development of the conflict view, right? So he really started to look at the conflict of access to resources between different communities within our society. So within the conflict perspective, we identify that social problems and the emergence of capitalism, right? So social problems, this is within the very foundational, the very beginning of conflict theory, looks at how capitalism pits different communities against each other for access to resources, inevitably leaving one of those communities without access to resources. This conflict conflict between the capitalist and the working class today, right? So one of those two communities, the working class doesn't have access to resources. Karl Marx identifies this as the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. You don't necessarily need to know that, but they're very important very important terms that you should probably know if you're going on any further in sociology or any of the social science cousins. So let's look at deviance as a Marxian conflict view, right? So we see that social problems is a function of the difference of power, right? So social problems arises out of that conflict between the difference of power associated with the different groups in our culture. So deviance and crime are a function of power. The rich and powerful are able to determine what conditions and behaviors are defined as social problems, right? So the individuals who are in power are the ones that get to identify what is norm and not normal, what is against the law and what is legal. So when we see the value conflict theory, social problems stem from conflict over values in society. So when we look at the Marxist, it is about competition and access to resources within an economic setting, while the value conflict theory looks at how social problems stem from the conflict of values. So groups vary in what they value. Examples are age and value differences, gender and value differences, ethnicity and value differences, religion and value differences, right? So we are a Christian nation, so Christianity gets the most of the value within our culture because we are based on those values. So value conflict theory defines social problems as conditions incompatible with those group values. So we look at our culture that is based on Christian values. Religions that are not within the Christian values are not as valued as Christian ideas. Do we follow that? We are a culture that is obsessed with youth. So individuals who are older don't have as much value as people who are younger. Do we follow? So then conflict theory again arises or is defined as social problems as conditions incompatible with group values. And then think about which group holds which value and have the power to enforce them. Cool? So think about for a second just a particular couple of groups or a social problem. And then within that social problem, think about the values that are associated with your social issue and then who has the power to enforce those. So then our third one is the interactionist perspective. So far we've covered functionalist, conflict, and now we're into interactionist, our third foundational theory for the semester. So the interactionist perspective, individual levels explain for social problems. This is a process by which different people define a condition as a social problem. Within the interactionist perspective, we identify labeling, which is the interactionist view of deviance. So social problems are conditions, behaviors, and situation defined and labeled as social problems. So a social problem really isn't a social problem until we label it or identify it as a social problem. And all of this is contextual or individual within the different communities and different people, right? So what a social problem might be for me is not necessarily a social problem for you. Or a social problem for my community isn't necessarily a social problem for other communities. Do we follow? So then within social construction of social problems are then created through others' actions and raise consciousness to society's issues. So let's think of a social problem today of poverty, right? So some people experience poverty while other people don't, especially within our current economic environment. More and more people are moving from the middle class to the lower class, then shifting from the lower class to the working class, shifting from the working class to the working poor, and then to the people under the poverty line. Does that make sense? So then looking at others' actions through that raise consciousness to society's issues. We also see protesting and rioting as others' actions to raise consciousness to social issues. We see political movements to raise consciousness to society's issues. So here is a way for you to review the three major perspectives on social problems, right? You can see the view of society on social problems, the origins of social problems, and proposed solutions. You are going to utilize this page to help you explore one particular social problem that you're going to choose in the discussion board. Cool. All right. So the natural history of social problems. So Malcolm Spencer and John Kitsu stages, right? So there are 4 stages of the natural history or natural progression of social problems. So both Malcolm and John identified the first stage is the problem definition. So first it has to gain public recognition for it to be a social problem. Next is legitimacy, which is acceptance of official agencies, right? So the people in power have to now accept that it's a social issue. Reemergence of demands, which is reasserting demands, right? So first we've defined our problem and it's gained public recognition. Next, the powers that be, right? The official agencies are government, education institutions, political systems have now accepted it as a social problem. Next is to have the reasserting of demands. This is what we need to have happen, or these are our issues. And then the last one is rejection and institution building, forming new organizations to solve problems. Which foundational theory would fit that best? If you guessed functionalism, you were very right? So forming new organizations to solve problems, right? So we can identify that like police brutality is a social issue. It gained public recognition and now it is gaining official agencies recognition. We have the reasserting of demands, what needs to happen, and then we have the rejection of institutions that are currently built and the forming of new organizations and institutions to solve the problem. So let's look at how the media, which is one of the largest agents of socialization, and some argue one of the primary agents of socialization. So mass media and the rapid spread of new information. So the media is often the vehicle by which the public becomes aware of social problems, especially now because a lot of people have access to video recording, audio recording, and digital media, right? A lot of people have access to social networking sites, to online data resources. So information is getting disseminated much faster, as well as there's a lot of different opinions or a lot of different resources that one can utilize to learn about these different social issues, right? So we're going to look at how the media and the need for news, right? So how has media, the different types of media, changed in how they disseminate knowledge or how they spread the news? Do they need news or do they sensationalize it? Is it more for a dramatic effect? Is it for shock factor? How much of the issues are being reported on a non-biased level? How many different ideas or perspectives are being shown on news media? Are news outlets being critiqued or criticized for getting information incorrect or for perpetuating or showcasing only certain particular views? And then we think about the public demand for sensational news stories. So unfortunately what's happened is that currently within our social structure we have become so desensitized to violence that violence isn't as sensational as it used to be. So we have to have more and more sensational news stories to get ratings, to get people who watch it, to get people who care, right? So last year we had more mass shootings than we had days in the year, and that happened the year before as well. So we've become so desensitized to mass shootings that unless it is of a horrific extent, or if it's involving important people or like sensational activity, then we don't really care, right? But the fact is that more than once a day, we had mass shootings in the United States, but we don't get that reported on because of the fact that it's not sensational news anymore. So then think of what social institution, agent of social institution is primary when it comes to the socialization and dissemination of knowledge, right? And really we just identified that media is arguably the most primary agent of socialization, starting from childhood, because that's what we are exposed to, especially as technological advances continue. We see that information is disseminated and we are surrounded by information. So this is where we're going to stop from here, and we're going to talk next time about the research styles on social problems.